In 1942, as the Pacific War widened beyond the expectations of its planners, the first battlefield reports began filtering back to Japanese headquarters. They came from islands recently contested, places thought marginal only months earlier, now carrying strategic weight far beyond their size. The tone of these early assessments was confident. The enemy, officers wrote, appeared raw, American Marines newly arrived, unfamiliar with jungle terrain, clumsy in movement, and prone to errors that seasoned troops would not make. Initial encounters seemed to confirm these judgments. Marines advanced aggressively, sometimes exposing themselves to fire, sometimes pressing forward when caution might have dictated delay. To Japanese observers trained in measured preparation and concealment, this behavior resembled recklessness rather than discipline. It was taken as evidence of inexperience, a lack of the internal restraint that Japanese doctrine equated with combat maturity. From this, expectations followed naturally. Under sustained pressure, these troops would falter. Cut off from comfort, isolated on remote islands, and subjected to determined resistance, their morale would erode. Japanese units anticipated rapid collapse once casualties mounted. The Americans, it was believed, lacked the spiritual endurance for prolonged hardship. What they brought in material, they would lose in will. Yet the reports soon began to complicate the picture. Casualty figures, initially assumed to favor the defenders, told a different story. Japanese units were suffering losses heavier than anticipated, even in engagements where tactical advantage seemed assured. Defensive positions held, but at a cost that could not be dismissed as incidental. The enemy was paying dearly, but so were those meant to repel them. More troubling was what followed. The Marines did not withdraw. After absorbing losses that should have broken cohesion, they regrouped and advanced again. Positions abandoned under fire were reoccupied. Attacks resumed where they were expected to cease. The pattern repeated itself, not once, but consistently enough to attract notice. Confidence gave way to confusion. The enemy's behavior no longer fit the model through which he had been understood. What appeared at first as recklessness now looked uncomfortably like resolve. The Marines were not retreating to recover morale. They were pressing forward despite the cost. For Japanese commanders accustomed to seeing collapse follow attrition, this was unsettling. The early certainty with which the enemy had been judged began to erode, replaced by a quieter, more disconcerting realization. Something about these troops did not align with expectation. And as further reports arrived from across the islands, a question took shape, one that would grow harder to ignore. If these Marines were supposed to break, why were they still advancing? The fighting on the islands did not unfold as Japanese commanders had anticipated. Engagements that were expected to conclude swiftly instead stretched into days, then weeks. Timelines drafted with confidence began to slip. Positions meant to be probed and abandoned turned into contested ground. The enemy did not retreat into the jungle and disappear. He remained, pressing forward under conditions that should have forced withdrawal. Marines continued to advance even when fire intensified. Small units moved through broken terrain with a persistence that confounded defenders accustomed to seeing momentum falter under sustained resistance. Losses mounted, yet attacks resumed. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden erosion of will. Instead, pressure accumulated steadily, almost mechanically, as if driven by a logic unfamiliar to those watching it unfold. Night attacks were expected to restore balance. Darkness had long favored Japanese defenders, dissolving cohesion and testing morale. But these efforts failed to produce the desired effect. Marine positions held through the night, sometimes clumsily, sometimes at high cost, but without yielding ground. When morning came, the Americans were still there, dug in, reorganizing, preparing to move again. Commanders began noting an aggressiveness that did not match their earlier assessments. This was not the impulsive recklessness they had first identified, but a sustained willingness to engage and re-engage. Marines adjusted to terrain quickly, altering formations, changing approaches, and learning from each failed attempt. What should have been fatal inexperience became, instead, a process of rapid adaptation. Resistance stiffened where it was expected to fade. Each attempt to exhaust the enemy produced the opposite effect. Firepower increased, coordination improved. The Americans seemed to absorb punishment and return with greater effectiveness. Attrition, long assumed to be decisive, no longer produced predictable outcomes. This inversion unsettled Japanese planners. Their doctrine rested on the belief that pressure revealed weakness, that prolonged hardship separated the resolute from the unfit. Yet here was an enemy that did not break under stress, but reorganized within it. The Marines were not immune to fear or loss, but neither were they governed by them in the expected way. As reports accumulated, a quiet realization took hold. The framework through which the enemy had been understood was no longer sufficient. The Americans were behaving outside familiar patterns, responding to conditions in ways that doctrine did not explain. Something fundamental was being misunderstood. And until that misunderstanding was corrected, every plan built upon it would continue to fail. By mid-1942, the tone of Japanese casualty reports had changed. Numbers that once appeared manageable now accumulated with troubling regularity. Each week brought new tallies from island garrisons, officers lost, veteran soldiers gone, units reduced beyond easy repair. These were not the losses of a single failed engagement, but of sustained fighting that refused to resolve itself. What had been expected to break the enemy was instead eroding the defenders. Defensive positions fell, but far more slowly than planned. Ground that doctrine suggested could be held indefinitely required constant reinforcement. Every ridge and clearing demanded attention, ammunition, and lives. Even when positions held tactically, they no longer delivered strategic relief. The Americans returned, adapted, and pressed again. Victory at one point on the map no longer translated into control of the campaign. The Marines absorbed losses in a way that unsettled their opponents. Attacks that should have stalled under fire resumed after brief pauses. Units reformed. Leadership reasserted itself. The advance continued, often with the same formations that had just been mauled. Casualties, which Japanese planners expected to dissolve cohesion, instead became part of a grim rhythm of movement forward. Tactical success began to lose meaning. Japanese units could inflict damage, even repel assaults, yet still find themselves retreating days later. Each engagement consumed resources that could not be replaced at the same pace. The Americans, by contrast, appeared able to absorb loss without surrendering momentum. The balance between effort and outcome grew increasingly uneven. Commanders sensed an erosion of control. Plans drawn with precision failed to produce decisive results. Timelines slipped. Local victories did not accumulate into strategic advantage. The enemy dictated the tempo, not through brilliance, but through persistence. This was a form of pressure Japanese doctrine had not been designed to counter. At the heart of the problem lay a growing realization: the enemy's resolve had been underestimated. Not misunderstood in theory, but misread in practice. The Marines were not advancing because they were careless. They were advancing because they were structured to continue despite loss. What appeared irrational was, in fact, systematic. Shock gave way to uneasy reassessment. The early confidence that had framed the Pacific campaign began to fracture, replaced by questions that had no immediate answers. If casualties did not stop the Americans, and if time favored them rather than the defenders, then the foundation of earlier assumptions was unsound. And as Japanese commanders weighed these reports, a more troubling thought emerged: if the cost of misjudgment was already this high, what would happen when the war demanded even more than endurance alone? Before the first American landings, Japanese commanders entered the Pacific War with a coherent and deeply held worldview. It was not improvised in 1941 or 1942. It had been cultivated over decades of conflict and reinforced by recent success. At its center stood a conviction that war was decided less by material advantage than by spirit. Endurance, sacrifice, and obedience were not simply virtues, they were weapons. Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual superiority as the decisive factor in battle. Soldiers were trained to endure hardship without complaint, to obey orders without hesitation, and to accept death as a duty rather than a failure. This ethos was believed to confer an inherent advantage over opponents who fought for pay, comfort, or abstract political ideals. Victory, in this view, flowed from willpower refined by ideology. Western soldiers were therefore judged through a narrow lens. They were seen as materialistic, dependent on comfort and supply, and psychologically fragile under sustained pressure. Discipline, Japanese commanders believed, emerged from belief rather than repetition, from moral conditioning rather than procedural training. Without an animating spirit, an army could appear powerful while remaining hollow. Colonial forces encountered earlier in the war reinforced these assumptions. Rapid victories over British, Dutch, and other Allied units seemed to confirm that Western armies lacked resilience once shock and deprivation set in. Collapse followed defeat quickly. Resistance faded. The lesson appeared clear: modern weapons could be impressive, but they did not compensate for weakness of will. American Marines were initially placed within this same category. They were assumed to be no different, another Western force reliant on firepower, unprepared for prolonged hardship, and vulnerable to isolation. Their equipment might be formidable, but their resolve was expected to erode once comfort disappeared. Jungle warfare, attrition, and time would expose the limits of their character. Early victories hardened these beliefs. Success validated doctrine, and doctrine discouraged reconsideration. Japanese commanders saw no reason to revise assumptions that appeared to explain events so effectively. Confidence became institutional, reinforced by promotion systems and operational planning alike. What worked was preserved. What challenged it was discounted. Over time, doctrine hardened into certainty. The idea that spirit outweighed material ceased to be a guiding principle and became an axiom. Alternative interpretations were unnecessary, even unwelcome. The enemy was understood in advance, defined by what he lacked rather than what he might do. This certainty shaped expectations across the Pacific. It dictated how battles were planned, how resistance was measured, and how success was defined. And for a time, it seemed unassailable. What Japanese commanders did not yet grasp was that their assumptions rested on a partial truth, one that mistook visible comfort for weakness and overlooked a different kind of discipline taking shape across the ocean. And when that discipline finally revealed itself in combat, certainty would give way to something far more dangerous: disbelief. Japanese planners entered the Pacific War with a clear vision of how it would unfold. The opening phase would be decisive. Rapid offensives, delivered with speed and coordination, would shock the enemy into strategic paralysis. Key territories would fall quickly, lines of communication would be severed, and the psychological balance of the war would tilt irreversibly. The objective was not merely to seize ground, but to impose a sense of inevitability. Once that shock was delivered, the war would change character. Defensive battles would follow, not to reclaim initiative, but to exhaust the enemy's morale. Island positions were chosen less for their intrinsic value than for their capacity to drain willpower. Terrain was considered decisive. Jungles, heat, disease, and isolation would do what weapons alone could not. The environment itself would become an ally, steadily eroding an opponent unaccustomed to sustained hardship. Attrition, in this framework, favored Japan. American forces were assumed to be intolerant of prolonged loss. Casualties might be acceptable in brief, dramatic engagements, but not over time, not in distant places with unclear strategic value. The longer the war dragged on, Japanese commanders believed, the more pressure would build within the enemy's political system. Democracies, they assumed, lacked the patience for wars without clear endings. Prolonged resistance, therefore, was not anticipated from the Americans. Once initial offensive succeeded and defensive lines hardened, the enemy would reassess. Negotiation would follow exhaustion. The war would end not with total defeat, but with compromise, Japan retaining its gains, its prestige intact. This expectation shaped both planning and restraint. There was no perceived need to prepare for a long war of material replacement and continuous assault. This theory rested on coherence. Each phase reinforced the next. Shock led to fatigue. Fatigue led to negotiation. It was a model refined through earlier conflicts and reinforced by cultural assumptions about endurance and will. For Japanese commanders, it explained not only how they would fight, but how the enemy would respond. Yet even as the first island battles unfolded, reality began to diverge from theory. The shock phase succeeded tactically, but its psychological effects proved fleeting. defensive battles did not exhaust morale as expected. Terrain inflicted suffering, but not surrender. Attrition did not produce collapse, it produced adaptation. What Japanese doctrine had not accounted for was an enemy willing to absorb loss without recalculating objectives. An enemy that did not measure endurance by comfort, but by organization. The Americans did not retreat into negotiation when confronted with hardship. They adjusted, reinforced, and returned. This divergence was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as temporary resistance. But with each passing month, it grew harder to ignore. The war was not following its expected arc. The enemy was not responding as predicted. And as theory lost its explanatory power, Japanese commanders faced an unsettling prospect. If the enemy would not be shocked, would not be exhausted, and would not negotiate, then the war they had planned for was not the war they were fighting. Japanese commanders did not misjudge the Marines out of negligence. They misjudged them because the information available did not align with the frameworks through which it was interpreted. Intelligence assessments focused on order of battle, equipment, and numbers, but offered little insight into training culture. What the Marines had been prepared to do, how they were taught to fight, recover, and adapt, remained largely invisible. Amphibious doctrine, in particular, was underestimated. To Japanese planners, landing operations were inherently fragile, dependent on surprise and vulnerable once resistance stiffened. They assumed such assaults would succeed briefly, then falter under sustained pressure. What they did not fully grasp was that the Marines were not improvising amphibious warfare, they were rehearsing it relentlessly. Landings were not the culmination of an operation, but its opening condition. American resilience was therefore misread as recklessness. When Marines pressed forward after taking losses, it appeared irrational rather than intentional. Japanese commanders interpreted persistence as a failure to recognize danger, not as a calculated acceptance of it. The distinction mattered. Recklessness collapses under pressure. Discipline absorbs it. Cultural assumptions compounded this error. Japanese doctrine equated resolve with ideology, and ideology with national character. Because Americans were perceived as lacking the same spiritual framework, their behavior was filtered through expectation rather than observation. When Marines endured hardship, it was treated as anomalous. When they adapted quickly, it was dismissed as temporary. Evidence that contradicted belief was explained away rather than examined. This distortion shaped battlefield analysis. Reports emphasizing Marine aggressiveness were read as signs of desperation. Rapid recovery after losses was attributed to numerical advantage rather than organizational resilience. Each engagement was interpreted in isolation, preventing recognition of a larger pattern. The enemy was not behaving irrationally, he was behaving consistently, just not in a way doctrine predicted. Japanese commanders continued to expect collapse because their model required it. Attrition was supposed to work. Isolation was supposed to weaken morale. Time was supposed to favor the defender. When these outcomes failed to appear, the response was not immediate revision, but renewed confidence that collapse was merely delayed. Tomorrow, or the day after, the Americans would finally reach their limit. But the Marines were operating outside familiar models. They did not equate loss with defeat or pause with recovery. They fought as part of a system designed to replace leaders, redistribute units, and continue forward movement under stress. Initiative was decentralized. Adaptation was expected. Failure was treated as instruction rather than proof of inadequacy. Misjudgment thus became systemic. It was reinforced by doctrine, validated by selective evidence, and embedded in planning assumptions. Each new engagement was approached with the same expectation, and each failure to confirm it deepened confusion rather than clarity. The enemy was being observed, but not understood. By the time Japanese commanders recognized that their assumptions were not merely flawed but obstructive, the consequences were already unfolding. Plans built on expected collapse continued to fail. Defensive positions were designed to break morale that did not break. Attrition was applied to an opponent structured to endure it. And as this realization began to surface, slowly, reluctantly, it carried an unsettling implication. If the Marines had been misunderstood not at the margins but at the core, then the war ahead would not be won by waiting for weakness to appear. It would have to be fought against an enemy whose strength lay precisely where it had been assumed to be absent. What Japanese commanders were encountering on the islands was not improvisation born of desperation, but a method shaped long before the first landing craft touched shore. The marine way of war began in training, relentless, repetitive, and deliberately unforgiving. Amphibious assault was not treated as a special operation or a rare contingency. It was the foundation. Marines trained to land under fire, reorganize amid chaos, and continue inland without pause. Confusion was not an anomaly, it was an expected condition. This preparation extended beyond individual toughness. Small unit leadership was emphasized with unusual intensity. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to assume responsibility when plans unraveled or leaders fell. Orders were designed to provide intent rather than instruction, allowing initiative to survive disruption. In combat, this meant that momentum did not depend on perfect communication. When one element stalled, another adapted and moved. Initiative under fire was not merely permitted, it was expected. Marines were taught that hesitation invited failure and that action, even imperfect, preserved tempo. This mindset allowed units to recover quickly from losses that might otherwise have paralyzed them. Decisions were made close to the point of contact, informed by training rather than waiting for permission. To an observer expecting rigidity, this appeared chaotic. In practice, it was controlled decentralization. As the campaign progressed, combined arms integration evolved rapidly. Infantry learned to coordinate closely with artillery, naval gunfire, and air support, refining procedures under combat conditions. Firepower was no longer applied as a blunt instrument, but as a shaping tool, suppressing defenses, isolating positions, and reducing strong points systematically. Each island became a laboratory where lessons were absorbed and applied almost immediately to the next fight. Logistics followed the assault units closely, another feature often overlooked by adversaries. Supplies were pushed forward aggressively, sometimes under fire, ensuring that momentum could be sustained once a foothold was gained. Ammunition, medical support, and replacements were organized to arrive quickly, reducing the operational impact of casualties. The Marines did not fight as isolated formations, they fought as part of a continuously supported system. This system was not static. Marines adapted tactics island by island, responding to terrain, enemy defenses, and previous mistakes. Frontal assaults gave way to envelopment. Firepower replaced exposure. Engineers reshaped ground to favor movement and protection. What failed once was revised, not repeated. Adaptation was not a post-war exercise. It occurred in real time, often between engagements measured in days rather than months. Flexibility, over time, became a weapon in itself. It denied the enemy predictability. Defenses designed to exploit known patterns found themselves outpaced by change. The Marines did not rely on a single method of advance or a single solution to resistance. They arrived prepared to learn, to absorb loss, and to adjust accordingly. This willingness to evolve under pressure contrasted sharply with doctrines that prized consistency over responsiveness. To Japanese commanders, this approach was difficult to categorize. It lacked the visible markers of ideological discipline they recognized, yet it produced consistent results. Marines fought hard, but more importantly, they recovered quickly. Losses did not halt operations, they informed them. Failure did not signal collapse, it signaled adjustment. What emerged was not a style of war built on bravado or blind aggression, but on institutional learning. The Marines' effectiveness lay not in any single battle, but in the accumulation of adaptation across many. Each island sharpened the next assault. Each lesson reduced future cost. By the time Japanese planners began to grasp this pattern, it was already embedded across the Pacific. The enemy they faced was not growing weaker with experience, but stronger. And the realization carried an unsettling implication. This was not an army waiting to be broken. It was one designed to learn faster than resistance could stop it. The first true test came at Guadalcanal. There, the Marines absorbed losses that stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of the Pacific War. Heat, disease, and exhaustion pressed as relentlessly as the enemy. Early assaults were costly, sometimes improvised, and often paid for in blood. Victory, when it came, did not arrive cleanly. It arrived through endurance and adjustment. Guadalcanal forced hard lessons into doctrine. Frontal assault against prepared positions proved ruinous. Attacks launched without sufficient fire support stalled quickly. The Marines learned that courage alone was insufficient against well-sited defenses. Survival depended on coordination, patience, and overwhelming force applied at the right moment. These lessons were not debated in classrooms. They were learned under fire. Firepower began to replace exposure. Infantry assaults were increasingly shaped by artillery and naval gunfire, reducing enemy positions before Marines closed in. The goal shifted from seizing ground quickly to neutralizing resistance methodically. Where Japanese defenders relied on concealment and fortification, the Marines responded with sustained bombardment and controlled advance. Time was spent to save lives later. Engineers became central to this transformation. They cleared obstacles, breached defenses, and reshaped terrain to favor movement and protection. Artillery units refined their coordination with forward observers, delivering fire with growing precision. The battlefield itself was altered, trees felled, ground leveled, approaches carved where none had existed. Terrain ceased to be an immutable challenge and became something that could be worked upon. Naval and air support integrated more tightly with ground operations. Ships offshore adjusted fire in response to infantry movement. Aircraft struck defensive positions moments before assaults began. Communication improved, procedures standardized, and trust built across branches. What had once been separate arms became components of a single system, synchronized by necessity. Japanese defenses, formidable in isolation, were gradually reduced through this integration. Positions that had resisted early assaults were isolated, suppressed, and dismantled piece by piece. The process was deliberate rather than dramatic. Progress was measured not in sudden breakthroughs, but in the steady elimination of resistance. Each successful method was noted, refined, and carried forward to the next island. Adaptation accelerated as the campaign continued. The Marines did not wait for perfect solutions. They applied what worked, discarded what did not, and moved on. Losses were still heavy, but they became more predictable, more controlled. The enemy's advantage in preparation eroded as American methods improved faster than defenses could be redesigned. To Japanese commanders, this evolution was deeply troubling. The enemy they faced at Guadalcanal was not the same enemy encountered later. Each engagement seemed to produce a more capable opponent. What began as costly persistence hardened into effective practice. The Marines were learning faster than the battlefield could punish them. This capacity to learn under fire altered the balance of the war. The Pacific campaigns were no longer contests of isolated bravery, but of institutional adaptation. The Marines were not merely surviving combat, they were transforming it. And as this transformation took hold, it became clear that the cost of early misjudgment had produced something unexpected. The Americans were no longer paying for inexperience alone. They were investing it, turning loss into method, and method into momentum. As the campaign unfolded across successive islands, Japanese commanders began to register changes that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The Marines were no longer attacking with the apparent impulsiveness described in early reports. Their advances became measured, deliberate, and tightly coordinated. Ground was taken in stages, each movement supported by fire and secured before the next began. What once looked like reckless aggression had resolved into method. Casualties, though still significant, no longer reduced momentum. Units that suffered losses did not stall or dissolve. Attacks resumed after brief pauses, often with adjusted tactics that reflected what had just failed. The rhythm of operations remained intact. From the Japanese perspective, this was deeply unsettling. Attrition was supposed to thin resolve, to slow decision-making and fracture cohesion. Instead, it seemed to harden purpose. Replacements arrived with disturbing speed. Fresh Marines appeared in units that should have been exhausted, their presence restoring strength without disrupting continuity. Leadership gaps closed quickly. The flow of personnel suggested an underlying system capable of absorbing loss without altering tempo. For defenders accustomed to fighting with finite reserves, this resilience felt inexhaustible. Morale, too, behaved unexpectedly. Under sustained pressure, Marine units did not display the signs of psychological erosion Japanese doctrine had long emphasized. Fear was present, but it did not dominate. Fatigue accumulated, but it did not paralyze. Even after nights of bombardment and days of close combat, the Americans remained organized, responsive, and willing to advance. Stability under stress became a defining characteristic. Defensive positions that once promised endurance were now being isolated and dismantled systematically. Marines identified strong points, cut them off, and reduced them with combined fire rather than frontal assault. Positions that had held against earlier attacks fell once supporting elements were neutralized. The process was methodical, almost clinical. What had once been a battle of wills became a contest of systems, and the outcome grew increasingly predictable. This pattern forced Japanese commanders to reassess Marine capabilities. The enemy was no longer viewed as merely persistent or well-equipped. He was understood as adaptive, disciplined in a way that did not rely on ideology alone. The Marines were learning faster than defenses could be redesigned. Each engagement refined their approach, narrowing the margin of error. Gradually, contempt gave way to reluctant respect. Not admiration, never that, but recognition. The Americans were no longer underestimated as soft or careless. They were acknowledged as a formidable opponent, one whose strength lay in consistency rather than spectacle. The very traits once dismissed as weaknesses, material support, procedural training, organizational depth, were revealing themselves as decisive advantages. This shift in perception did not bring relief. It brought clarity, and with it a sense of foreboding. If the Marines continued to fight this way, methodical, resilient, and increasingly efficient, then the balance of the campaign would continue to tilt against the defenders. Time, once assumed to favor Japan, now appeared to be working in reverse. By the time this realization settled in, it was already too late to undo the assumptions that had shaped earlier planning. The Marines had been discovered not in theory, but in practice. And what Japanese commanders were beginning to see was not an enemy that could be shocked or exhausted, but one built to endure, replace, and advance. The next question was unavoidable. If this enemy could sustain pressure indefinitely, what would happen when the war demanded not just adaptation, but endurance over months and years to come? The turning point of the Pacific War did not arrive in a single moment, but through a series of battles that forced Japanese commanders to confront an altered reality. Places like Tarawa and Saipan became more than names on operational maps. They became proofs, demonstrations that the assumptions guiding Japanese defense were no longer valid. At Tarawa, Marine assault struck one of the most heavily fortified positions the Japanese had constructed. The defenders expected the landing itself to fail, the reef and concentrated fire to break the attack before it reached shore. Instead, the Marines endured catastrophic losses and continued forward. The cost was staggering, but the objective was taken. What stunned Japanese observers was not the violence of the assault, but its outcome. A defense designed to be decisive had been overcome directly, not circumvented or abandoned. Saipan deepened the realization. There, Marine operations unfolded with a grim efficiency that left little room for reinterpretation. Fortified lines were breached, reorganized, and breached again. Defensive depth, once considered the answer to American firepower, failed to halt progress. Each fallback position bought time, but not reversal. The Marines advanced steadily, reshaping the battlefield as they moved. Japanese losses in these battles became irreplaceable. Elite units were committed and destroyed without achieving their strategic purpose. Officers trained over years were lost in days. Unlike earlier engagements, there was no prospect of replenishment at equal quality or scale. Attrition, once expected to exhaust the attacker, now hollowed out the defense. With each island secured, the strategic initiative shifted further out of reach. The Americans dictated where and when the next battle would occur. Japanese commanders found themselves reacting rather than shaping events, deploying forces to meet threats that arrived on American terms. The arc of the campaign bent steadily toward Japan's inner defenses. Defensive doctrine faltered under this pressure. Depth failed because it could not regenerate. Terrain failed because it could be neutralized and reshaped. Morale failed because losses accumulated without relief. The mechanisms designed to slow the enemy succeeded only in clarifying the imbalance. It was here that recognition set in. Not hope, not defiance, but recognition. Japanese commanders understood that momentum had passed a point of recovery. The Marines were no longer merely winning battles, they were imposing a rhythm the defense could not disrupt. The war's trajectory had shifted decisively. This was the moment when expectation gave way to acceptance. The enemy once believed vulnerable had proven capable of sustained assault against the strongest positions Japan could construct. The Pacific War had entered a new phase, one defined less by surprise or spirit than by endurance applied at scale. The turning point was no longer theoretical. It was written into the casualty lists, the lost islands, and the narrowing perimeter. And as the implications settled in, Japanese commanders were forced to confront a sobering truth: the Marines were not advancing toward exhaustion. They were advancing toward inevitability. What Japanese commanders now confronted was not simply an enemy capable of winning battles, but one structured to sustain them. The Marines did not surge forward and then fade. They maintained pressure over months, returning to the fight with a consistency that redefined what endurance meant in the Pacific. Campaigns no longer hinged on brief windows of opportunity. They unfolded as prolonged tests of capacity. This endurance was not accidental. Logistics supported continuous pressure with an efficiency that grew more apparent as the war lengthened. Supplies moved forward predictably. Ammunition shortages did not dictate tempo. Medical evacuation reduced the long-term impact of casualties. Units that fought hard were relieved, refitted, and returned to action. The machinery behind the front ensured that effort could be renewed rather than exhausted. Training pipelines reinforced this resilience. Losses that would have crippled other forces were absorbed and replaced. New Marines arrived prepared for the conditions they would face, trained not only to fight, but to integrate quickly into units already under strain. Leadership gaps closed. Skills were transferred. Experience accumulated institutionally, even as individuals fell. The war did not reset with each battle, it advanced. For Japanese commanders, this revealed a disparity that could no longer be ignored. Material imbalance had existed from the beginning, but now its consequences were unavoidable. Where Japan husbanded resources carefully, the Americans expended them to maintain momentum. Where Japan sought decisive engagements to offset scarcity, the Marines imposed continuity. Attrition, once expected to favor the defender, began to favor the attacker. This shift altered the value of tactical brilliance. Skillful defenses could delay, but not reverse, the outcome. Clever maneuvers might inflict losses, but those losses did not accumulate strategically. Each success purchased time, and time increasingly benefited the Americans. The Marines were not racing against collapse. They were advancing within a system designed to outlast resistance. The realization was sobering. Japanese commanders had planned for a war that would be decided by resolve under hardship. They now faced an enemy whose resolve was reinforced by organization. The Marines' endurance was not a matter of ideology alone, it was sustained by logistics, training, and replacement at a scale Japan could not match. As months passed, the pattern hardened. American operations did not crescendo and then diminish. They persisted. Pressure was reapplied after every pause, often with greater effectiveness than before. The defense could not regenerate fast enough to meet each new demand. What had once been a contest of wills became a contest of systems. This was the moment when the balance of the war truly changed. Not because a single battle was lost, but because the structure of the conflict no longer offered a path to recovery. The enemy was built for endurance, and endurance favored accumulation over brilliance. In private assessments, Japanese officers began to acknowledge what public doctrine could not. Against an opponent like the United States Marine Corps, time was no longer an ally. Every month deepened the imbalance. Every engagement reinforced it. The Pacific War had entered its decisive phase. Not one defined by sudden collapse or dramatic reversal, but by the steady application of pressure that could not be escaped. The Marines did not need to win quickly. They needed only to keep going. And as this understanding settled in, it carried a grim implication. If endurance, not inspiration, now governed the conflict, then the outcome was being shaped far from the battlefield by systems that could replace loss, sustain effort, and continue forward long after resistance had reached its limits. Away from public statements and official communiques, the tone of Japanese internal reports shifted markedly. Language once confident became measured, then restrained. Assessments circulated within commands acknowledged what battlefield experience had made undeniable: the Marines were effective, not by chance or excess, but by design. The enemy could no longer be explained away as inexperienced or lucky. He had demonstrated consistency. Underestimation was discussed openly in these private evaluations. Early assumptions were identified not as minor errors, but as foundational misreadings. Commanders recognized that they had judged the Marines through cultural expectation rather than observation. What had been labeled recklessness was reinterpreted as persistence. What had seemed wasteful now appeared deliberate. The enemy had been misunderstood at the outset, and that misunderstanding had shaped every decision that followed. Descriptions of the Marines grew precise and unsentimental. They were characterized as relentless, not because they sought destruction for its own sake, but because they did not disengage once committed. They returned after losses. They reorganized under pressure. They applied force methodically until resistance ceased. This relentlessness was not emotional, it was procedural. And that distinction mattered. As these conclusions took hold, defensive planning grew increasingly pessimistic. Plans were no longer framed around decisive repulse, but around delay. Time was sought not as a path to victory, but as a means to prepare for the next inevitable assault. Positions were constructed with the expectation that they would fall. The goal shifted from holding ground to inflicting cost, even as the limits of that approach became clear. Victory was no longer assumed. This marked a profound psychological shift. For years, doctrine had rested on the certainty of eventual success, if not through arms, then through endurance. Now, endurance appeared asymmetrical. The Americans could sustain pressure longer than Japan could sustain resistance. This realization did not produce panic, but it drained confidence from strategic thought. Respect emerged, but it was stripped of admiration. Japanese commanders did not praise the Marines, they acknowledged them. Respect, in this context, meant recognition of capability without affection or concession. The enemy was no longer dismissed, but neither was he romanticized. He was assessed as he was organized, adaptive, and difficult to stop. With this recognition, illusions fully collapsed. The war that had been imagined at the outset no longer existed. The enemy was not fragile. He was not seeking a way out. He was advancing deliberately, supported by systems that transformed loss into continuity. These private admissions did not alter the course of the war. They came too late for that. But they marked an internal reckoning, a moment when belief yielded to experience, and doctrine confronted its own limits. What remained was not hope of reversal, but acceptance of a changed reality. The Marines had been discovered not as symbols, but as an operational truth. And once that truth was acknowledged, the remaining question was not whether the war could be won, but how much it would cost before it ended. The recognition of Marine effectiveness did not arrive without consequence. It arrived alongside catastrophic attrition. Japanese forces across the Pacific were worn down battle by battle, their losses no longer recoverable. Units that had once formed the backbone of island defenses were consumed in engagements that delivered no strategic reprieve. Each island exacted a price that could not be repaid. Elite formations suffered most acutely. Troops trained for decisive engagements were committed piecemeal, drawn into battles meant to delay rather than decide. Their destruction was gradual, often invisible beyond the immediate front, but cumulative in effect. What had been concentrated strength dissolved into scattered resistance. Experience, once a multiplier, became a diminishing resource. Defensive doctrine proved insufficient against an enemy that refused to disengage. Fortifications delayed the inevitable but did not prevent it. Tunnels, bunkers, and depth positions imposed cost, yet they failed to alter outcome. Each defense was overcome through persistence, firepower, and method. The Marines did not need to defeat doctrine outright. They needed only to render it irrelevant through repetition. Marine persistence became decisive precisely because it was unremarkable. There were no singular moments of collapse, no dramatic failures that could be isolated and corrected. Instead, pressure accumulated steadily. Attacks followed withdrawals. Withdrawals followed bombardment. Over time, the defenders were denied rest, denied replacement, denied relief. The system grinding them down was larger than any individual battle. Japanese commanders began to confront strategic exhaustion. It was not simply a shortage of men or material, but of options. Every course of action led to further depletion. There was no maneuver left that promised recovery, no decisive blow that could reset the campaign. The enemy's strength lay not in surprise, but in continuity. The Marines returned again and again, each time with undiminished capacity. The discovery of this reality came too late. By the time Japanese commanders fully grasped the nature of the enemy they faced, the conditions required to respond no longer existed. Industrial disparity, logistical reach, and training pipelines had already shaped the battlefield beyond correction. Recognition did not bring adaptation. It brought resignation. This was the irreversibility of the cost. Losses sustained early, under false assumptions, could not be undone. Units destroyed could not be replaced in kind. Time spent waiting for collapse could not be reclaimed. The war's trajectory had been set by misjudgment as much as by combat. For Japanese forces, the Pacific Campaign became a series of sacrifices without strategic redemption. Courage remained. Skill remained. But they operated within a narrowing margin defined by an enemy who could afford persistence and a system that rewarded it. The Marines' advance was not halted because it was never meant to be halted by any single defense. In this way, the cost of discovery was paid twice. First in lives lost while clinging to outdated beliefs. Then in the realization that those beliefs had shaped defeat. The Marines had not merely outlasted resistance. They had revealed the limits of a doctrine built for a different kind of war. By the time the lesson was fully learned, it could no longer change the outcome. The price had been exacted, the balance altered, and the path forward constrained by what had already been lost. Discovery had arrived, but only after the cost had become irreversible. By the later stages of the Pacific War, the Marines had come to represent something larger than a fighting force. They embodied industrial warfare applied to infantry, an approach in which endurance was not improvised but engineered. Battles were no longer decided solely by courage at the point of contact, but by the ability to generate, sustain, and renew pressure over time. The Marines were the visible edge of a system that transformed capacity into combat power. This system fused training, logistics, and leadership into a single continuum. Training prepared units not just to fight, but to absorb disruption. Logistics ensured that loss did not translate into paralysis. Leadership emphasized intent over instruction, enabling action to continue when plans unraveled. Each element reinforced the others. The result was not perfection, but reliability, the ability to continue under conditions designed to stop lesser forces. Individual courage remained essential, but it was no longer isolated. Bravery did not have to compensate for systemic weakness, it was amplified by support. Marines fought knowing that ammunition would arrive, wounded would be evacuated, and replacements would follow. This assurance did not remove fear or sacrifice, but it changed their meaning. Loss could be endured because continuity was assured. Flexibility replaced rigid doctrine. Where pre-war theories emphasized fixed methods and decisive moments, Marine operations privileged adaptation. Tactics were revised between landings. Procedures evolved under fire. What mattered was not adherence to a template, but responsiveness to reality. The battlefield became a feedback loop, and learning became a weapon. The Pacific War revealed the full implications of modern amphibious power. Landing forces were no longer transient raiders dependent on surprise alone. They were sustained instruments capable of returning again and again, reshaping defenses through repetition. Shorelines ceased to be barriers and became entry points for a system that could project force, recover, and reapply it elsewhere. For Japanese commanders, this marked a transformation they could not counter in kind. Gradually, the nature of the enemy became clear. The Marines were not merely resilient individuals, but representatives of an organizational model that rewarded persistence. Their effectiveness lay in accumulation of experience, of material, of method. Each battle added to a growing advantage that did not dissipate with loss. The war favored those who could convert scale into steadiness. Japanese commanders grasped this transformation with reluctant clarity. They understood that they were no longer facing an opponent whose resolve could be tested into submission. They were facing a system that made endurance routine. Traditional measures, spirit, terrain, even tactical ingenuity retained value, but they could not overcome an adversary built to learn and continue. This realization carried a broader implication. Warfare had entered a new era in which outcomes were shaped less by singular acts of brilliance than by sustained organizational capacity. The decisive arena expanded beyond the battlefield to encompass training depots, supply chains, and command cultures that could absorb shock without breaking. Infantry, once the most vulnerable expression of power, had been integrated into an industrial framework that sustained it. In this sense, the Marines represented a turning of the page. They showed how modern states could apply industrial principles to the most human form of combat, closing with the enemy on contested ground, and prevail through continuity rather than collapse. The Pacific War made this visible with unforgiving clarity. What remained was the moral weight of that discovery. If wars would now be won by systems as much as by soldiers, then responsibility extended beyond courage alone. It rested with those who designed the structures that sent men forward again and again. And as the islands fell and the perimeter receded, the lesson settled in quietly. The Marines had revealed not just how the war was being fought, but how future wars would be decided. After defeat, Japanese commanders were left with time to reflect on a war whose outcome now seemed painfully clear in retrospect. In memoirs, internal histories, and private correspondence, the tone was no longer defiant or explanatory. It was subdued. The Pacific campaigns were revisited not to justify decisions, but to understand how certainty had given way to inevitability. Early assumptions appeared naive when stripped of wartime urgency. The belief that spirit alone could compensate for material disparity, that hardship would dissolve American resolve, that isolation would produce surrender, each had seemed reasonable within the framework of pre-war doctrine. Yet those beliefs had not survived contact with reality. They had explained the opening phase of the war, but not its course. The Marines were no longer misunderstood. They were no longer reduced to caricature or misread through cultural expectation. They were recognized for what they had been from the beginning, disciplined, adaptive, and sustained by systems that allowed them to endure losses without surrendering momentum. The mystery had not been their courage, but the structure that supported it. Victory, Japanese commanders concluded, had never been about spirit alone. Resolve mattered, but it did not exist in isolation. It was shaped, reinforced, and preserved by organization. Training taught Marines how to fight and recover. Logistics ensured that effort could be renewed. Leadership distributed responsibility so that loss did not equal paralysis. What appeared on the battlefield as determination was, in truth, the visible result of preparation. Systems sustained resolve. That was the lesson written across the islands. The Marines did not triumph because they were immune to fear or fatigue. They triumphed because fear and fatigue did not end the fight. The machinery behind them, industrial, institutional, and procedural, absorbed shock and returned pressure. The war rewarded continuity more than sacrifice alone. History records this discovery without drama. There is no single document, no formal declaration of realization. It emerges gradually through changed language and altered emphasis. Where once commanders spoke of moral superiority, they later spoke of material reality. Where once collapse was predicted, endurance was acknowledged. The shift was quiet, but complete. In this way, the Pacific War offered a broader reflection on modern conflict. It revealed that battles are not isolated contests of will, but expressions of deeper systems. Infantry no longer fought alone, even when they fought on remote islands. They carried with them the weight of organization, its strengths and its consequences. For Japanese commanders, this understanding came too late to alter events. But it shaped how the war was remembered. The enemy they faced was not the one they had prepared for, and not the one they had expected to defeat. He did not falter when hardship came. He adapted. The lesson was etched not in a single defeat, but across a chain of islands where resistance met persistence and slowly gave way. It was a lesson paid for in lives and territory, and learned only through loss. They expected an enemy that would falter. They found one that adapted and endured.